We arrived at the hospital in Tooting a little just too late, and he'd already passed. And we weren't allowed to see him. We weren't allowed to go near him at that point, because as soon as that had happened, he becomes evidence. Everything about him becomes evidence, and we weren't allowed to touch, not been able to see.
Senior investigating officer Nick Scola had been drafted in with his homicide team to investigate an unprovoked and brutal murder on Clapham Common. They had identified the victim as 24-year-old bar manager Jody Dabrowski.
Police turned up on the door early morning, and it didn't make sense. You know, when we were told it was, we were told he'd been attacked. We were trying to figure out what was it about. You know, we assumed it was something to do with work, where he had maybe had a problem with some clients. You know, we arrived at the hospital in Tooting a little just too late, and he'd already passed. And we weren't allowed to see him. We weren't allowed to go near him at that point, because as soon as that had happened, he becomes evidence. Everything about him becomes evidence, and we weren't allowed to touch, not been able to see.
Having quickly identified Jody Dabrowski as the victim, investigators needed to start looking at his attackers. They had one vital witness statement as their lead.
The witness was only able to say that there was 2 white attackers, and that they believed from what the attackers said that it was a homophobic attack, and they described as one attacker being taller than the other attacker.
Jody's murder did not provoke a widespread panic in the LGBT+ community, but it did reinforce the notion that we are not truly safe, that at any moment, out of the blue, we could be set upon and perhaps even killed. And that created a level of anxiety, understandably, among LGBT+ people.
It's not just a murder, it's a Cat A murder, it's a homophobic attack, and it's also a hate crime. And when you get those 3 things together, you find that there's going to be immense internal and external scrutiny. And that's what causes some difficulty for some SIOs.
Back in the investigation room, Graham reviews the crime scene with Nick Scola.
We've got some pictures that are relevant to the investigation. This first picture, can you talk me through it? It appears to be Clapham Common.
This is the common. You can see how isolated it is. This was the crime scene itself. In the centre of the picture you can see some debris, and that's where the paramedics had tried to save Jody's life or treated him at the scene. When they leave the scene, they leave the bandaging and the open packaging that they'd used there, just in case there's any potential forensic retrieval from that. That's where he would have been attacked, where you see that. You get the impression, looking, you see there's no natural street lighting in the area because the attack was carried out after dark, so you can see how difficult it would be for any witnesses or anybody else to identify the parties involved.
Absolutely. What Nick Scola had to do was keep the investigation focused while he was under quite significant pressure to solve the case.
Some years before, I'd worked at Battersea Police Station, which was the area that covered the common, and I dealt with another incident in a hostel. It was a very grand old house, and it struck me as I walked in what a nice house it had been, and how grand it had been at one stage. So I had people go back to that address, but made it a wider line of inquiry to establish what other large houses had now been converted into hostels in the vicinity of the common. We knew 2 men had attacked Jody. There's nowhere really nearby convenient to park a car, so you got the impression they were walking somewhere. They could have driven there specifically to attack someone at 11:30 at night, but I thought that was unlikely. They'd probably been walking to a transport hub, or they may have been walking home. And if they're walking home, a hostel was one of the options.
Nick Scola's hunch about the hostels was absolutely spot on.
It was a good line of inquiry because the team went and visited hostels, and as they visited one particular hostel, one of the residents who hadn't been in touch with us in any way told us that 2 of the other residents had come back late that Friday night covered in blood and talked about giving someone a good kicking on the common.
SIO Nick Scola and his team are closing in on 2 suspects over the brutal murder of bar manager Jody Dabrowski in Clapham. 2 men have been identified as prime suspects, Scott Walker and Thomas Pickford.